What is up, ladies and gents? This is George Bean, and what I'm about to review may be out of the usual things I do, but this was so interesting that I could not resist the feeling in making a review about this. In this video, I am reviewing the made-for-TV documentary film Final Cut, The Making of Heaven's Gate and the Unmaking of a Studio, which was based somewhat on an autobiographical book of the same name by Stephen Bach, who was a former executive at the independent film studio United Artists. Final Cut was a television documentary that chronicles the making of the 1980 film Heaven's Gate, which at the time was the most expensive flop ever recorded. So much so that it had single-handedly bankrupted a film studio. To start off, in 1978, the independent production studio United Artists had experienced a somewhat turmoil when top executives Arthur Krim and Bob Benjamin had resigned from their positions at UA, after having heated differences with their parent owner company, Transamerica. Kim and Benjamin would go on to make their own production studio, Orion Pictures, while executives Stephen Bach and David Field were left to take the mantle of UA in the wake of Krim and Benjamin's resignations. With UA somewhat in shambles, Bach and Field had wanted to put UA back on top while also wanting to make their own marks on the company. And so they had decided they wanted to make a movie they themselves greenlit. Thus, after seeing the 1978 film The Deer Hunter and being impressed by it, Bach and Field had decided that they wanted to work with its director, Michael Cimino, offering to fund whatever film he had wanted to make. Cimino chose a pet project he had in mind since 1969, titled The Johnson County War. When pitching his project, Cimino claimed to Bach and Field that he could make the film on a budget of $7.5 million, and thus they gave him that funding and also carte blanche on the film, meaning that Cimino essentially had massive creative control over his own film. But even then, even before filming had even started, problems began to emerge. Cimino had chosen a French actress, Isabelle Huppert, for a major supporting role, but Bach and Field didn't want Isabelle because she had yet to learn to speak English fluently. But in the end, Cimino had won this battle and Isabelle had gotten the part. But in retrospect, we can say that this would be the first warning sign of things to come. Then come April of 1979, and the Academy Awards festival happens. As a result, The Deer Hunter ends up winning 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Supporting Actor for Christopher Walken, and most of all, Best Director for Michael Cimino. It seemed like this had given the UA execs high hopes for Heaven's Gate. They were now absolutely sure they had a huge hit on their hands. Just 1 week later, Cimino would begin principal photography on Heaven's Gate, confident that his new film would be the Gone with the Wind, or the Lawrence of Arabia of the American West. And yes, that was exactly what Cimino, the whole cast and crew, and even United Artists had thought of Heaven's Gate. They had believed that they were making their own Gone with the Wind, an epic film that would propel them into the Academy Awards, and huge newfound success. Little did they know, however, as filming would progress, that they were heading down a road of massive misfortune, and ultimately embarrassment and failure. During filming, it quickly became apparent of Cimino's extreme perfectionism, his extreme attention to detail, which would end up slowing filming down to a glacial pace. At one point, when they were filming the scene where Chris Christopherson was to crack out a whip, apparently Cimino had shot that minor scene at a maximum of 50 takes. And another time, Cimino had demanded that an entire train be moved to a different location. And on another time, Cimino had apparently halted an entire day of filming just so he could shoot a scene with a cloud he felt was right, thus resulting in them waiting endlessly for the right cloud to appear, to the point where they had even skipped lunch break. Having no experience in filmmaking, Bockenfield had considered three options. Option 1 was the Cleopatra option. The Cleopatra was a 1963 epic film, but its production costs became so overwhelming that it had forced 20th Century Fox to close its doors for 4 months, take everyone off payroll, and hope for the best. It was only the public's fascination in its stars Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor that had saved the film and Fox itself from complete financial disaster. Bockenfield couldn't pick this option, because they could not close the doors to the studio for months and hope for the best. Option 2 was the Queen Kelly option. Queen Kelly was a 1928 silent film directed by Erich von Stroheim. Von Stroheim's vision was epic, but the film's overt sexuality and his unbridled spending had forced the studio, ironically United Artists, to shut down the film. Bockenfield could not choose this either, because they would have been under heavy scrutiny for firing a director who had just won an Academy Award for his previous film and all that stuff. And so they decided to choose option 3, which was the Apocalypse Now option. Apocalypse Now was a 1979 war film directed by Francis Ford Coppola, which, during its production, was suffering from massive setbacks such as typhoons, heart attacks, frustrated actors, etc. But in the end of it all, it had become a big success, winning awards, and is now considered to be one of Francis Coppola's best films alongside The Godfather. So feeling they could pull an Apocalypse Now out of Heaven's Gate, Bockenfield had decided to choose that option. But eventually, it could not work out in the end, and almost close to firing Cimino, but eventually Bockenfield had decided to fire Joanne Corelli, Cimino's producing partner, and give Cimino a new demanding schedule, becoming more stricter to him, on the threat that he would lose final cut on the film if he continued with his slow progression. He finally sped up, and it turns out that he was doing very well with the new shooting schedule. But unfortunately, it was too late, because an article was published by a freelance journalist named Les Capet, who had worked as an extra on the film for 2 months. In this article, Capet had revealed what he had witnessed during the 2 months working as an extra on the set of Heaven's Gate, including the 50 takes incident, extras fainting, horses getting harmed, Cimino's obsessive perfectionism, everything. The article had spread like wildfire in Hollywood and the entire country. Thanks to this article, the public had went into this movie knowing of its production troubles. Many cite Les Capet's revealing article as a contributing factor that led to Heaven's Gate's failure. But after 11 months of filming, principal photography had finally ended in March 1980. By that point, having costed nearly $30 million. After 3 months of editing, in late June 1980, Cimino had finally previewed a work print of the film for the UA execs. According to a clause in his contract, It was said that the film was to run at least no longer than 3 hours in length. But shockingly, the work print he showed them ran at a length of 5 hours and 25 minutes long, of which Cimino said was about, quote unquote, about 15 minutes longer than the final cut would be. And apparently, according to Stephen Bach, the final climactic battle alone had lasted the length of a feature-length movie on its own. But after watching the work print, it was clear to Stephen Bach that any hope he had in the film being a hit had evaporated. They had lost confidence in Heaven's Gate being a huge hit. So Cimino went back into the editing room and scaled the film down to 3 hours and 20 minutes. The execs had also insisted that the film be released in cinemas on the Christmas season, so that it could be nearby the Academy Awards season. With this new cut, the film was released on November 21st of 1980. According to those who attended the premiere, the audience reaction was not quite well. Apparently only one person clapped hesitantly. It was pretty clear that the receptions were very mixed, bordering non-negative. And the movie in that cut had only been in theaters for just 1 week before it was pulled out of theaters. Many had blamed UA for that decision, but it was actually Cimino who had made that decision, claiming he had wanted to edit the film down again, and to hopefully make it, at the very least, decent for audiences. He eventually cut the film, now a third time, this time down to 2 hours and 29 minutes. This cut would be released in April 1981 in Los Angeles. Film critic Roger Ebert had criticized that cut for its formal choices and its narrative consistencies and incredulities, and concluded that it was the most scandalous cinematic waste I have ever seen. Vincent Canby also did not let up on the film, claiming that the new cut was, quote-unquote, like a fat person who'd been on a crash diet, thinner but not appreciatively different. But in the end, the film's budget had ultimately ballooned up to $44 million, making it the most expensive film at its time. Even at that time, that was a lot of money to spend on a movie. You gotta remember that. Today, most movies are now being made with a budget as high as $200 million. But back in 1980, $44 million was considered to be very expensive. Upon its release in theaters, the film had only managed to gross up to $3.5 million in its domestic box office, and had received the reviews were overwhelmingly poor. As a result, the movie had flopped, and has been considered one of the biggest box office bombs of all time. I mean, wow, this movie had crashed and burned. The reviews were so bad that New York Times critic Vincent Canby, in his review, said, quote, "The movie fails so completely that you might suspect Mr. Cimino sold his soul to the devil to attain the success of Deer Hunter, and the devil had just come around to collect." And compared to the film to, quote-unquote, a forced 4-hour walking tour of one's own living room, that's kind of harsh. Immediately afterwards, Heaven's Gate had been seen as like a lightning rod example of what happens if you give a director too much control over a film with no oversight. This film had effectively ended the new Hollywood era of director-driven films in the 1970s, and it leaned back towards greater studio control of films, as had been predominant in Hollywood until the late 1960s. After what had happened with Heaven's Gate and the UA studio, many other studios in Hollywood had decided that they did not want such a similar thing to happen to them either, and so they decided to take back control over films, something of which is still happening to this very day. Who knew? And as for United Artists, because of the film's massive failure, it was very apparent to Stephen Bach that he was going to be fired from UA, and he was. He would go on to write a book about the making of this movie and UA's subsequent downfall in a book titled Final Cut, which would become the basis for this TV documentary. And also, Bach had unfortunately passed away in 2007 as a result from cancer. And as for United Artists itself, well, just a few days after Bach's firing, Transamerica had formally announced that it was intending to sell UA off to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, or MGM, claiming that it was tired of being involved in the movie business. This had sent huge ripples throughout Hollywood. Many see the film as being such a huge failure that it had single-handedly bankrupted the studio. And as for Michael Cimino, he would go on to make 6 more films afterwards. But it was pretty clear that his career, once thought promising from the success of Deer Hunter, had been destroyed by the failure of Heaven's Gate. It was such a bomb that public perception of Cimino's work was tainted in its wake. The majority of his subsequent films achieved neither popular nor critical success. In fact, many critics who had originally praised Deer Hunter then became far more reserved about the picture and about Cimino after Heaven's Gate. Now, I will say this. Heaven's Gate is not a bad film as the critics had initially claimed it to be. It is not. It is a decent film. There is a masterpiece hidden with it. You just have to look for it, which is not a good thing to do, exactly. I have seen the film, and I will say, based on how I feel about it, the cinematography in it is beautiful. It is visually beautiful to watch. It is gorgeous. But the plot itself is a bit of a drag. The dialogue is okay, which is helped especially by the performances, especially by Chris Christopherson and Jeff Bridges, with also some surprisingly good moments from Brad Dourif and John Hurt. But again, the movie is very slow burning in terms of pacing, and there are several scenes that go on very long, which may lead some to believe to be unnecessary, and some may say should be cut. When having to watch the film in its original 3.5-hour cut, you'd have to be within the right set of mind to sit through the whole film, based on how you watch a certain type of film. In a way, it sort of feels like a no-win scenario on this movie. If you watch the director's cut, it feels very long and requires a lot of your time. But if you watch the theatrical cut, it feels like there are scenes that are cut out that could help flesh it out. But I don't really know. At least that was how I felt about the film. But overall, I'm willing to give the Final Cut documentary a rating of 7 stars, because it is a very well-made documentary about the making of Heaven's Gate, the creative choices everyone had made on it, such as Michael Cimino and United Artists, and how the film's overwhelming failure had resulted in the film studio to go bankrupt and end the new Hollywood era of director-driven films. The stories the people involved bring up are very intriguing to watch, especially from Stephen Bach himself, about their experience working on the film, especially from the cast and crew, and the aftermath of its release. Possibly the only person who didn't get involved in this documentary was Cimino himself. I guess he was one of those who doesn't want to talk about these types of stories about their own movies. But still, I'd highly recommend Final Cut if you are interested in movies and how they are made in Hollywood. In fact, you can actually find a documentary on YouTube right now. I have made you can find a link to it in the description box or comment section below this video. So yeah, check it out if you can. So, thank you for watching, ladies and gents, and until then, I will see you all next time. Peace!